The boat was too small for all of them. Noura clutched her brother's backpack to her chest, the straps soaked in salt water, the zipper half broken. It wasn't hers, but it was all she had left of him, her younger brother Sami, gone since. The bombing that had leveled their apartment complex in Aleppo. In the chaos, she'd found the bag lying near a burned stairwell. Inside was a photo of the two of them, aged 5 and 7, smiling with mouths stained by watermelon. That was months ago, or maybe years. Time stopped making sense after she buried her mother in a shallow grave with bare hands and wandered on foot through Turkey's border checkpoints with strangers who didn't speak her language, who only understood the universal hunger of survival. Now, the sea lay ahead. The Mediterranean glistened under a cold moon, beautiful and deceptive. The smuggler, a man with a cigarette clamped between his yellow teeth, motioned toward the boat with a grunt. There were at least 30 of them, crammed, onto something meant for maybe 10. Noura sat at the edge, her knees pulled to her chest. A toddler cried beside her. His mother murmured prayers in a language Noura didn't know. Someone vomited over the side. The smell of diesel and fear thickened the air. When the engine sputtered to life, silence fell. No one said goodbye. They already had. The boat cut through the dark, and Noura watched Syria vanish behind her, not with relief, not yet, but with the numb ache of a wound too deep to feel. She didn't cry. There were no tears left, only the sea. They arrived on the Greek coast 12 hours later. It was barely dawn. The sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon, but the shore gleamed with the flash of cameras, journalists, aid workers, volunteers in orange vests. Noura stumbled onto the rocky beach, her legs cramping and clothes soaked. A woman ran up to her, offering a blanket. Another handed her a bottle of water. She barely heard them over the roaring in her ears. A medic knelt in front of her. "Ah, you hurt?" Noura shook her head, not trusting her voice. He checked her pupils anyway, then gave her a small energy bar. "You're safe now," he said gently. She didn't believe him. Safe was a word people threw around too easily. That night, Noura lay on a cot in a refugee intake center near Athens. The walls were white, the air thick with body heat, murmured, Arabic, Dari, Somali. A poster on the wall had pictures of smiling people beneath the words, "Welcome to Europe," in 6 languages. But no one felt welcome here, only tolerated. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine her mother's voice, the smell of cardamom and lemon from the kitchen, Sami trying to braid her hair and failing spectacularly, their rooftop, where she'd once studied for her final exams. It all felt like fiction now, a different girl, a different life. She was 19, but tonight she felt ancient. The next morning, they processed her intake. Her Syrian passport was half burned, but her identity was verified by UN records. She was granted temporary asylum and transferred to a women's shelter in Thessaloniki while they sorted her paperwork. The shelter had 3 cots to a room. She was paired with Miriam from Eritrea and Selda from Iraq. They spoke broken English, and Noura knew a little from school. They made do with gestures, half-sentences, and shared trauma. At night, Noura dreamed of bombs, but in the mornings she helped Selda cook for the younger girls and listened to Miriam sing softly to herself in a voice as delicate as thread. Something fragile was growing here, not peace, but maybe hope. One afternoon, a volunteer named Katia asked Noura if she wanted to attend free language classes. "Yes," Noura said, voice hoarse from disuse. "Please." The first class was humiliating. She couldn't understand the verb charts or the strange shapes of Greek letters. But the teacher, a young man named Andreas, was kind. He smiled when she mispronounced words and encouraged her when she stumbled. "You're doing fine," he said. "It's hard, but it gets easier." Noura nodded. That night, she wrote down every new word in a battered notebook she'd found at the shelter. Her handwriting was shaky, but each line felt like a tiny reclaiming of self. Her name meant light. She wrote that down too, just to remember. The weeks passed slowly. She got a temporary ID card, found work washing dishes at a small taverna where the owner barely spoke, but nodded in approval when she showed up early every day. Her hands were always wet, her feet always tired, but for the first time in months, she felt like part of the world again. People saw her, not just as a refugee, but as a person. One evening, she walked home from work, past the harbour. The sea was calm. She stopped and watched the water. The same water that had almost swallowed her, that had stolen others. Now it looked so peaceful. She realized she didn't hate it anymore. It was just the sea. Later that night, as she sat at the shelter with Zelda and Miriam laughing over something silly on a shared phone, Noura felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Stillness, not joy, not yet, but the absence of fear. And that for now was enough. The office smelled like old coffee and disinfectant. Noura sat in a stiff plastic chair, her back straight, hands clenched in her lap. In her bag was every document she owned, photocopies, translations, and her battered Syrian ID clutched like lifelines. Across the desk, a woman with rectangular glasses typed without looking up. Noura's translator, a middle-aged Lebanese man named Rami, gave her a reassuring nod. "Just answer simply," he said in Arabic. "She's here to help." But Noura had learned not to trust too easily. Kindness in one moment could be revoked the next. Paper walls could collapse. And in this new country, everything, her future, her worth, her right to stay, came down to these fragile sheets of printed proof. "Full name?" the official asked. "Noura Sami al-Khatib. Date of birth? March 2nd, 2004. Place? Of origin? Aleppo." The woman looked up at that, not with judgment, more like recognition. "Aleppo," she repeated softly, and her typing slowed. There was a long pause. Then came the real questions, the ones that burned. Do you have surviving family? No. Are you seeking reunification with anyone? No. Did you serve with any militant groups? No. Have you experienced physical or psychological trauma? Noura hesitated. Rami gently cleared his throat and leaned in. "She's asking if you have PTSD or health issues." Noura's fingers trembled. I don't know. Sometimes I can't sleep. Sometimes I see things. I hear bombs again." The official nodded as if she'd heard this before. "Would you be open to a psychological evaluation for your claim?" "Yes," Noura whispered. She didn't know what good it would do, but she'd say yes to anything that might help her stay. Outside the immigration office, the sun was far too bright. Athens buzzed with a springtime energy that felt unreal after the sterile silence of government buildings. "Your application is strong," Rami said as they walked. "Your case is clean, your story checks out, and you've already been working. It may take months, but you have a good shot." Noura tried to feel encouraged, but a good shot felt like saying the sea might not drown you. "Thank you," she said quietly. They passed a bakery, the scent of warm bread drifting into the street. Noura's stomach growled. "Eat," Rami said with a smile, pointing toward it. "You've earned it." She smiled back, just a little. Back. At the shelter, Zelda was gone. A note on her bed said she'd been moved to a permanent housing program. Miriam was sitting cross-legged on her cot, sorting through beads for a bracelet-making workshop. "You okay?" Miriam asked in English. Noura shrugged. "Interview?" She nodded. Miriam offered her a red bead. "I make one for you, to celebrate." Noura hesitated, then took the bead. In that moment it was more precious than gold. The next few days blurred. Noura continued washing dishes at the taverna, her hands growing raw and red from the industrial soap. The owner, Nikos, spoke even less than she did, but on the third morning he brought her a cup of coffee and gestured for her to sit. They shared it in silence before the shift. That small act, quiet, unspoken, felt like the beginning of something. At night, she studied. Language classes had shifted from Greek to include English, and though it made her head ache, she refused to stop. She wanted to be able to understand the news, to speak for herself at the next interview, to one day maybe apply for university again, if she dreamed big enough. She carried her notebook everywhere, jotting down new words like they were keys to invisible doors. One evening, as she sat near the window writing, Miriam leaned over and asked, "Why learn both?" Noura smiled faintly. "Because I want to understand people." Miriam chuckled. "People hard to understand." "Still worth trying," Noura said, "but the days weren't all progress." One morning at the metro station, a man in a navy coat spat at her feet. "Go home," he growled in Greek. Noura froze, her scarf wrapped tight around her neck. She didn't reply. What could she say? He was gone before she even breathed again. She stood there, shaking. Back at the shelter, she didn't tell anyone. Instead, she scrubbed her skin raw in the shower, as if that might wash away what he'd said. That night, she didn't sleep. Her nightmares returned with a vengeance. Sammy's face blurred into the sea. Her mother's voice screamed from beneath rubble. The dinghy overturned. Water filled her lungs. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The counselor at the clinic she'd been referred to was gentle and soft-spoken. She asked questions in Greek, then English, and then gave up and simply let Noura speak. "I feel like I'm waiting," Noura said, her voice cracking. "Like my life hasn't started yet, like I'm in between everything." The counselor nodded. "You are in between, but that doesn't mean you're nowhere. You are becoming." Becoming Noura rolled that word around in her mind for days. The paper wall of bureaucracy remained. Weeks passed with no updates on her asylum case. Her boss gave her more hours at the taverna. The dishwasher broke, and she washed every dish by hand. At the shelter, a new girl arrived, Sana from Sudan, who cried herself to sleep every night. Noura brought her tea and whispered, "You're safe here." The lie tasted bitter, but she meant it with all her heart. Then, in the middle of May, a letter arrived, stamped by the Greek Ministry of Migration. Noura stared at the envelope in her hands for a long time before opening it. Inside, her asylum claim had been provisionally accepted. She would receive a temporary residence permit for 3 years. Tears flooded her eyes. Miriam hugged her. "You stay," she said. "You can stay." For the first time in forever, Noura allowed herself to cry. But these tears were different. These were for relief, for gratitude, for the door that had finally opened. That night, she stood again by the sea, this time not as a fugitive, but as someone with a name, a status, and a path forward. The same waves lapped against the rocks, but they didn't scare her anymore. She had crossed something bigger than water, and on the other side, she was still here, still standing, still becoming. The first night Noura slept without. Nightmares came a week after the letter arrived. It wasn't a peaceful sleep. Her dreams were filled with rushing trains, unfamiliar words, faces she half remembered, but for once she didn't wake up gasping, just blinking, confused, as sunlight streamed across her pillow. She lay still for a while, listening to the quiet hum of morning in the shelter, the rustle of bedsheets, someone boiling water in the shared kitchen, Miriam humming a tune from home. The sounds were ordinary, simple, beautiful. She sat up slowly, stretching, and for the first time since she arrived in Athens, she realized this could be home. Her first little victory came that morning when she ordered coffee at the taverna. Entirely in Greek, "Ένα café, parakalo," she said, trying not to sound nervous. The man behind the counter blinked. Then, with a nod. Zachary. Ne, ligo. When he handed her the cup, she said, Evcharisto, and walked out of the shop grinning like a child who had just learned to ride a bike. It was silly, just coffee. But it meant something. It meant she could learn, adapt, thrive. It meant she didn't have to be invisible. That afternoon at the taverna, Nikos motioned for her to come to the kitchen. She assumed something was broken again, but instead he handed her a clean apron. You cook? She blinked. A little, at home. My mother. He gestured toward the stove, where a massive pot of stew was simmering. Show me, he said, and just like that, she was in the kitchen. It started small, chopping vegetables, seasoning sauces. She showed him how her mother used to add cinnamon and allspice to meat dishes. He raised an eyebrow, then tried it, and nodded with gruff approval. Wordlessly, he handed her more ingredients. By closing time, she'd prepared part of the day's special. When they sat down for staff meal, everyone dug in. Who made this? One of the waiters asked, mouth full. Nikos pointed to Nura. They clapped. She smiled, flushed with pride. That night, she walked back to the shelter with aching feet and a full heart. The next little victory came on a Tuesday evening when Miriam dragged her to a local community center. It's a women's group, she said. We meet. We talk. Sometimes we scream. Sometimes we dance. You'll like it. Nura hesitated at the door. Social gatherings still made her nervous. Too many voices. Too many stares. But she followed Miriam inside, clutching her bag like a shield. The room was painted in cheerful colors, coral, yellow, teal, and the chairs were mismatched but inviting. Women from all over the world gathered in a circle. Somali, Iranian, Ukrainian, Greek. Some spoke English, some didn't, but they smiled at Nura as she entered. Welcome, one said. The evening passed in a blur of laughter, shared stories, and tea. One woman played music from Eritrea on her phone. Another passed around small biscuits she'd baked. Nura was quiet at first, listening, but eventually she spoke. Just a few words about her work at the taverna, about her dream to go back to school. They nodded. No one interrupted. No one asked for her trauma like it was a badge to prove her. In place, they simply listened. By the end of the night, she'd given them her name, and it mattered. A few weeks later, her residence card arrived. The real thing, a small piece of plastic with her name and photo, her legal identity in this new world. She picked it up from the municipal office, hands trembling slightly, and stared at it for a long time before slipping it into her wallet. Rami, who had helped her from the beginning, met her outside. You did it, he said. You're not a number anymore. You're a person here. I was always a person, she replied softly. He smiled. Yes, but now they see it too. With her papers secured, Nura applied for part-time classes at a local college. She enrolled in beginner English, computer literacy, and a culinary theory course. It was overwhelming. Half the time she didn't understand what the professors were saying, but she showed up every day, took notes, asked questions, and when she received her first graded paper, an essay about her favorite dish back home, and saw the handwritten B+ in red ink, she nearly cried. Miriam stuck it on the shelter wall with tape. Look at this girl, she said. Scholar in the making. Don't embarrass me, Nura muttered, hiding her face, but she kept the paper, folded it neatly into her notebook like a small treasure. There were setbacks, too. One morning, she missed the bus and arrived at work, 30 minutes late. Nikos didn't yell, but he didn't let her cook that day either. Just dishes. She felt the shame curl up inside her like smoke. At the shelter, a new resident accused her of acting better than everyone else. Nura didn't argue, but the words stayed with her for days, and one night while walking home, she heard sirens and ducked instinctively into a doorway, heart pounding as if the bombs had returned. But each time she kept going, kept showing up, because now she could. That summer, the taverna introduced a new dish, lamb with cinnamon and allspice. Noura's recipe, Nikos said when customers asked. Her name. On the menu, printed in ink. Miriam came to try it and made a show of weeping dramatically. "My friend is famous," she said, wiping her eyes with a napkin. Noura laughed until her stomach hurt. For a moment she forgot she was a refugee. She was just a cook, a student, a friend. Later that night, she sat by the window of the shelter and wrote in her journal, something she hadn't done in months. She wrote about her new room, small, shared, but hers. About the women's circle, about school, work, language. Her favorite word this week, resilient, she wrote, "I used to think survival was the end. But maybe it's only the beginning." She paused, then wrote one more sentence, "I think I'm starting to live again." Noura found the tree by accident. It stood at the far edge of the city park, gnarled and weathered, its thick branches curling like fingers reaching skyward. The olive tree was ancient, older than anyone she'd met in Athens, its trunk twisted and broad, hollowed slightly at the base, as if time itself had tried to carve out its heart and failed. She hadn't planned on walking that far. After a long shift at the taverna and a tiring afternoon of classes, she just needed air, somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the buzz of voices and the smell of kitchen grease clinging to her sleeves. The park was mostly empty, save for a few old men playing chess and children kicking a football in the distance. When she saw the olive tree, she felt something, an inexplicable pull, as if it were waiting for her. She sat beneath its shade, back against the cool bark, and closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like peace. Noura returned to the tree again the next day, and again the day after that. She brought her homework sometimes, spreading her notes out on the grass. Other times, she just sat and watched the world go by. Pigeons fluttered around the roots. A stray cat once curled beside her legs and purred itself to sleep. It became her sanctuary, a piece of stillness in a life still under construction. One afternoon, she carved something into the bark with the tip of a pen, a small heart, and the word Amal, her little sister's name. She hadn't spoken about Amal much since. She left Syria. The grief was too big, too wild, but here, under the branches of that ancient tree, she whispered her sister's name to the wind like a prayer. "Amal," she said quietly. "You would have liked it here. It smells like lemons and salt. And the light makes everything look golden." She smiled through tears. Maybe that's what healing looked like. A little light, a little salt. Back at the taverna, things were changing. Nikos had begun teaching her more complex recipes, traditional dishes with delicate timing and regional flair. Pasticcio, moussaka, braised octopus with tomato and wine. "You learn fast," he said one day, watching her fold phyllo pastry with practiced care. "Like your hands already know the story." "I used to cook for my family," she said. "My mother taught me," he nodded. "Good teacher then." They didn't talk much beyond the kitchen, but their shared language, flour, fire, salt, was enough. Miriam, meanwhile, had moved into a shared apartment nearby with 2 other women from the shelter. "You're next," she told Noura with a grin. "No more bunk beds and noisy plumbing." Noura wasn't sure she was ready. The shelter had become her cocoon, safe, familiar, but the idea of her own space, her own key, sent a flutter through her chest. She began saving more of her earnings, limiting small pleasures. No more coffee from the corner shop, fewer bus rides, more walks. She wrote down her goals on a scrap of paper and folded it into her wallet. Apartment. 2, finish language course. 3, start culinary training full-time. 4, visit Amal's grave. That last one she had never said aloud, but it stayed with her, heavy and soft, like an old song. The women's group at the community centre had grown too. One evening, they gathered around to share objects from home. Noura brought a scarf, deep green with golden thread, her mother's. She held it carefully, explaining in slow, quiet words that it had been with her since she fled. "I lost so much," she said, "but I still have this. And the memory of her teaching me to cook." The room was silent. Then another woman spoke, an older woman from Ukraine, describing her wedding ring, which she'd sewn into her coat during her escape. Another showed a cracked photo of her village. Another held up a book in Farsi. In that moment, Noura realized they weren't broken. They were becoming, not less, not erased, just new. One Sunday, she brought a picnic to the olive tree. Bread, olives, a boiled egg, a few ripe apricots. As she ate, she saw a man across the field watching her, not staring, just quietly observing, notebook in hand. After a few minutes, he approached. "Is it okay if I draw here?" he asked in halting Greek. "I like the tree." She blinked, then nodded. "Of course." He sat nearby, not too close, and began to sketch. They didn't speak again that day, but when he packed up to leave, he held up the sketchbook and showed her the drawing. A quiet rendition of the tree, its branches framing a small figure sitting beneath it. She stared. "That's me," he smiled. "Yes, you look peaceful." She smiled back. "Thank you." His name was Theo, a university student studying art. Over the next few weeks, they often found themselves under the olive tree at the same time. Sometimes they talked. Other times they sat in silence, sharing the shade like old friends. Noura told him about Syria, a little, enough. Theo listened without pity, without judgment. In return, he spoke about his mother, a painter who died when he was 14, and how he wanted to capture the world the way she had. "I think you already do," she said once, and he flushed, looking away. One evening he brought her a small drawing. Her again. This time laughing, a cat curled at her feet. "For you," he said. She took it with both hands, reverently. It was the first gift she'd received in this new life. By the end of summer, she had enough money saved to start looking for apartments. With Miriam's help, she visited 5 in 2 weeks. Most were tiny, cramped, or smelled of mildew. But the 6th, on a quiet street near the edge of the city, was different. It had a narrow balcony, a cracked but beautiful tile floor, and light that pooled through the windows like honey. She stood in the doorway and felt her heartbeat settle. "This is the one," she whispered. The next day, she signed the lease. The landlord handed her a set of keys. When the door clicked shut behind her for the first time, she pressed her forehead to the cool wood and let herself cry. Not for what she'd lost, but for what she'd found. That night, she visited the olive tree one last time. Not to say goodbye, but to say thank you. She brought candles, a scarf, a paper lantern, and a tiny wooden plaque she'd made with Miriam's help. "Here, I learned to be whole again." She tied it gently to one of the lower branches. Then she sat beneath it, eyes closed, feeling the wind on her face. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew who she was now, and that was enough. The first winter in Athens was harsher than Noura had expected. She'd heard stories from the other refugees about the cold, how it crept into your bones, how the city turned grey and unforgiving when the rain started, and the winds from the mountains cut through every layer of clothing you owned. But it was different when you lived through it yourself. Her little apartment, which had seemed like a palace in the warmth of summer, now felt like a place she had to fight to keep warm. She kept the stove on low, the oven door cracked, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she sipped hot tea and stared out the window at the grey sky. Some nights, it was so cold she could see her breath inside. But she didn't mind. It was hers. It was her space. She decorated the tiny apartment with what she could find. Mismatched cushions from the thrift store, a simple rug from an outdoor market, the small lanterns Theo had gifted her hanging by the window, her mother's scarf. still hung from the kitchen chair, though it now seemed to carry an even deeper weight, a reminder of how far she had come. But it was the quiet moments that hit hardest. When the world outside was frozen and the noise of the city muted, she sometimes felt the ache of absence, the emptiness of the family she'd lost. Her phone sat on the table, messages she hadn't read in weeks from her cousins, her aunt, people she barely recognized now. Every now and then she would open them, but there were no words that could fill the void. And so, she wrote, Noura took up the small notebook she kept by the bed and began to write in the fading light. She wrote about the olive tree, about Amal, about her mother, about the soup she had made for Theo the other night. Lentils and onions, something simple, but enough to bring a smile to his face. She didn't write about Syria anymore. Not the bombs, not the fear, not the hunger. She didn't need to. It was part of her now, woven into the fibers of who she had become. It didn't need to be retold. Instead, she wrote about what was ahead. A knock on her door broke the silence. She frowned, not expecting anyone. It was late, after dark. Slowly, she got up and opened the door. Theo stood there, bundled in a thick coat, his cheeks flushed from the cold. In his hands was a box wrapped in brown paper. "Hello," he said, his voice warm even in the chill. "I brought you something." Noura blinked, surprised. "Theo, what are you? You've been alone here for a while," he said, his tone light, "and I thought you could use a bit of cheer." She stepped aside to let him in. Inside, he placed the box on her small kitchen table. "Go ahead," he urged, stepping back to give her space. With a hesitant smile, Noura untied the string and unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small potted plant, an olive tree sapling, delicate and green, its roots wrapped carefully in soil. Her breath caught in her throat. "I thought," Theo began, his voice quieter now, "that you could have your own tree. One for, here, something to remind you of home." Noura reached out, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the small plant, the leaves soft beneath her fingers. She blinked away tears, overwhelmed by the simple, profound kindness of the gift. It was a gesture so small, yet it carried so much weight. She couldn't find the words right away, but then they came, a soft whisper. "Thank you." Theo smiled, his eyes gentle. "You're welcome." The winter passed, slowly, as they all did. Noura had found her rhythm, balancing her job, her studies, her cooking, and her solitary moments of reflection. There was a sense of peace that had settled within her now, like a river finding its course after years of being tossed and turned by the storms of life. She found strength in the routine, in the things she could control, in the small moments that made up her day. The plant grew slowly, a tiny olive tree now perched by the window, catching the first light of morning. In the evenings, Noura and Theo began sharing dinners together. Simple, humble meals, nothing extravagant. But to Noura, it was a sign of something more, of belonging, of trust, of hope. On a crisp day in early spring, Noura stood outside her apartment, her coat wrapped tightly around her, the little olive tree in a pot at her feet. She had a plane ticket in her bag, her first trip home since leaving Syria. Her journey had taken her so far from the person she had once been, yet somehow it had brought her closer to the woman she was becoming. Theo stood beside her, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Will you come back?" he asked quietly. "I will," she said, her gaze steady, though her heart stirred with an emotion she hadn't expected. "There's a lot waiting for me here. There's a lot waiting for me in Syria, too." He nodded, looking down at the ground. "I'll be here when you return," he said. "The tree will be waiting for you." Noura smiled, a small, quiet smile, and nodded. She looked down at the olive tree, her olive tree, and felt its roots, metaphorically and literally, begin to take hold in her life. As the plane ascended, Noura watched the city below grow smaller, the streets winding through the landscape like veins on a map. She could feel the weight of her decision, the bittersweet pull of returning to a place that could never be home in the same way again. But in her heart, she knew the truth. Home was not a place. Home was a journey. And wherever she went, whatever came next, she would be ready.